this book covers 6 states. I did the book on North Carolina foods, and as I was working on that book, one food per month, talking about the history of special tastes and smells that sort of define us as North Carolinians, I discovered that not all of those plants and animals, like oysters and soft-shell crab and ramps, are safe. They are somewhat endangered by a variety of human factors. And I got really interested in thinking about growing up in the South myself and what are those plants that define us as members of the community of the southern states. So I picked 6 states. I picked 12 plants. Not all of them are federally endangered, but they're important. And part of what I'm talking about with these 12 plants is how the Endangered Species Act is not enough to protect certain ecosystems and habitats. And so this book takes on, there are 12 chapters in the last book, 12 chapters in this book. It's really on the ground. And I grew up in the South with a grandmother who taught me a lot about plants, and I spent a lot of Saturdays going to nurseries. I was sort of bored out of my mind when I was a little kid going to nurseries while my grandparents looked at shrubs. But I came to appreciate how much I learned, and I think it is when we are children that nature holds the most magic for us. And once we're captured by nature as children, we kind of never lose that, I believe. But kids are not being captured by nature as much now, and that's a real concern. And memory, as this second quote talks about how important it is for us to value our memories of nature. And we are watching things developed and destroyed everywhere, and it becomes a source of grief. But remembering how much we enjoyed nature as children helps us get involved in conservation, I believe. So I'm not a botanist. I really just followed my curiosity, writing about something I didn't know that much about. So I learned a lot on the journey, and what I'm trying to do is take folks on the journey with me. When I was a kid, we visited beautiful natural places on vacation. My grandfather let me plant my first row of lima beans when I was 5. But when we lose a species, we lose a part of our identity. And so I'm hoping that part of the result of this book will encourage those of us who are older to nurture in our children and grandchildren an appreciation of nature. And even if it's just a few plants that can become part of our identity because of the special place we live. And of course, this morning, driving up the parkway from Little Switzerland, the service berries were blooming. And they were just like little clumps of white out there coming up the parkway. And that's part of our special identity in this part of the state. So this gives you a little bit of a picture of the botanical hot spots that we visited for the book. Donna Campbell, who is here, took the photographs for this book. And some of the plants are only located in 1 or 2 places left on the planet. And there are so many stories to tell, but here's Donna at Auburn University photographing a garden of beautiful carnivorous plants, pitcher plants, which is one of there are 2 species in Alabama that are in trouble that we went to see. And they're so much in trouble and so in danger of poaching that we had to keep it a secret where we went. And the guy who took us just gave us compass points, and we drove out to the middle of nowhere and waited for him to appear. It was a little scary. My editor said, "Oh, good, crime, that will sell books." So I was raised to pay attention to plants, and I suspect many of you were also. But kids today, as I said, are not so aware. The term plant blindness was coined by 2 botanists from the South. They said most people in developed nations tend to see plants as merely a green, blurry backdrop for the animals and human-made objects that populate their visual field. So if we're starting with plant blindness, we're in trouble. The the plant blindness that we've seen has resulted in a decline in enrollments in botanical courses in colleges and universities around the globe. And it makes it harder to raise money to preserve plants because people want to save the charismatic animals. And there's nothing wrong with that. But when the Endangered Species Act was passed in the 60s, it only covered animals. And it was a decade before they added 3,000 plants to the endangered species list. So the researchers who invented this term plant blindness surveyed high school students who were graduating, and 77% of those they questioned had never grown a plant by themselves. 10% had never picked fruit from a tree and couldn't remember any children's story that involved a plant. So it's time for us to teach our kids something. What we need to do is reconnect people to plants. And so today I'm going to start with chapter 1 of The Wild South because guess what? It takes place in the Blue Ridge Mountains. In fact, it starts in Blowing Rock, where two young men came to Blowing Rock for the summer to collect plants and to understand their odyssey in 1894 is to understand how botany has been practiced for a couple of centuries. So John Kunkel Small is one of the characters in the first chapter. He was a native of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, an avid plant collector. He was working toward a BA degree from Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And his classmate, Amos Arthur Heller, who I do happen to have a picture of, was also a Pennsylvania native, and he had come to Blowing Rock the summer before the two of them came down. And here is a picture of the Glee Club at Franklin and Marshall. And have you noticed all those guys look the same? And that's John Kunkel Small as a grown-up in the far corner up there. He could be any one of those people. So I showed this picture so that I wouldn't shortchange him as a youth. I think he was probably pretty cute. He was musical also. He would go on to play flute in the New York Philharmonic in addition to his duties at the New York Botanical Garden. But we'll get to that in a minute. So the guys got on a train in Pennsylvania and took it as far as it would get them, which was Salisbury, North Carolina. And then they had to find a taxi or a hack to carry them from Salisbury to Lenoir, through Happy Valley, and up what is now 321 to Blowing Rock. They did not come with financial support for their work. They only came with a passion for the natural world and the thrill of discovery. And they knew that there was amazing biodiversity in these mountains. They would write a journal of their summer's trip, and it was published by the New York, the Torrey Botanical Society in New York. So that was kind of a feather in their caps before they'd even graduated from college. It's written in the passive voice, so we don't really know which one of the guys was writing, but I think from my sources it was John Kunkel Small. He describes the hardships of plant hunting in the passive voice, so nobody's got ownership of any sentence in the book, right? You'll hear this in a minute. But they marched through the thickets of rhododendrons, and they were very scientific in their findings and very Victorian in their prose, but they still had a sense of humor, and it comes through in this journal and makes it very memorable. So here's a picture of Main Street in Blowing Rock in the 1890s. It was not quite so glamorous back then, and the boys, were wearing Victorian clothing and hiking in the mountains. It was hot, and they were pretty formal. They depended on the kindness of strangers to feed them. Sometimes they spent the night wherever they collapsed on the trail. But they made it through the high country. Now, this happened to be 1891, the year the Green Park Inn opened, and it was the most luxurious hotel in Blowing Rock, of course. Had a ballroom, a billiard room, bowling alleys, telegraph, post office. It sits on the Continental Divide, right at the headwaters of the Yadkin River, which will be important to this story. Margaret Mitchell wrote a portion of Gone with the Wind here. There were many personalities who came, but our botanists only passed by. They obviously couldn't afford to rent a room. Each room at the Green Park had complete toilet. They had a waterworks. They called it waterworks in the room, but they still had the old spring house here that was so important to the community. And I'm sure the boys took advantage of the Yadkin River springs. See the house back there in the corner in this antique photograph? It's still here in Blowing Rock, as you all know. And not too long ago, some construction workers actually dug up the culvert pipe that pipes away the headwaters of the Yadkin River under the pavement in Blowing Rock. The Yadkin River is an important part of this story, but we're still not there yet. Now, the guys mostly went on foot. They occasionally were able to ride a small gauge train when they went near Roan Mountain, but they didn't even have the benefit of horses. Now, understand, they're picking plants, they're getting plant samples and carrying them, and after a while, that gets kind of heavy. They were out for a walk after they'd set up their headquarters in Blowing Rock, and they came upon the Catawba rhododendron. And Small wrote, "A great quantity of bushes, 10 feet or more in height, and between the two of us, we almost lost our heads." So this is how excited they were about coming to see the plants in the exotic Blue Ridge. A few days after they settled in, they headed for the summit of Grandfather Mountain, again on foot. And the June wildflowers and shrubs were blooming on the rocks and ridges all the way, and they were awed. They gathered so many plant specimens. Now this is a vasculum, which is what the plant hunters used to carry back then, but it didn't hold very many plants. In fact, here's a picture of John Small many, many years later with just a big bag on his back. And that's how they collected plants. So the boys are coming back to Blowing Rock exhausted from their Grandfather Mountain trip, and John writes, "A good-sized bed of Fragaria virginiana, evidently uncultivated, but the fruit large and attractive looking. We saw many dozens of them. We collected them, but the receptacles into which they found their way were not our portfolios. They went straight into their mouths." About a month after they had been hiking every day and collecting plants, they took a break. On the 13th of July, our headquarters were filled almost to overflowing by the arrival of a party of friends from Salisbury, among whom were 6 young ladies. To say that we had an enjoyable time is a very temperate expression. So you get a sense of their humor. Then they decided to conquer Table Rock. So after their friends left, they wanted to go look over the wilderness of Linville Gorge. It was a 35-mile journey on foot and a steep ascent. And on their way, right around Wilson's Creek, they heard the unmistakable sound of a rattlesnake in the bush. So they cut a wide berth, and they were really shaken, but then they were really annoyed because our supply of rations for the day was somewhat limited at the start, and it was lessened considerably when one of us discovered that his share had disappeared. Of course, he began to get very hungry as soon as the loss was noticed, and there was great lamentation when he pictured how some wandering dog or perchance a bear would feast on his chicken and biscuits. Finding at length that the outer man was unable to make much headway, it was decided to fill up the inner one at the first suitable place. Our supply of rations was gone, but pie was demanded, but there was nothing of that description to be had. Cold potatoes and cornbread, the heaviness of which was enough to cause a man with a cast iron digestive apparatus to turn pale, were set before us. We ate, and to our astonishment, are still alive. You can imagine what coming upon a house and asking for food you might get. So the trip took several days, and finally, as they were climbing toward the summit of Table Rock, They were surrounded by a cloud of pesky bees that kept buzzing their heads. And 2 months later, when John Small got back to Pennsylvania and unwrapped the plants from that day, the bees walked out of the package. They were still there. So back in Blowing Rock, toward the end of the summer, they had hiked all over the place and collected many, many samples. They ordered lumber and they began building shipping containers to send all their plant samples back. What botanists did was they'd collect these samples and press them flat and then mount them on paper eventually and write the provenance of what they found. But on this last day, when they finished building the boxes, they decided to make one more climb along the ledges of Blowing Rock. They wanted to spot the August blooming Liatris helleri, which Heller had named after himself when he discovered it the year before. It's a species of aster. And so they started climbing along the ledges here. It's now only found, by the way, in 5 North Carolina counties, period, the end. Small wrote, "Many of the ledges are only a few inches wide and are not by any means safe places on which to ramble about, as the base of the cliff is more than 100 feet below. One of us has cause to remember the place," notice we don't know who, "for on that day his early career was almost ended. While carefully picking his way along one of the narrow ledges, his foot slipped and over he went, turning somersaults and desperately clutching at anything that offered support. A narrow shelf and a friendly bush finally stopped his descent after he had fallen about 15 feet. 2 badly damaged fingers and several minor bruises were fortunately the only results. But there was no sign of the blazing star." So after that summer of 1891, when Arthur Heller returned to Franklin and Marshall University, he would finish his degree in 1892 and then earn a master's degree in botany, all the while continuing his collections across the country. He taught at the University of Minnesota. He was hired by the New York Botanical Garden to work on the Vanderbilt expedition to Puerto Rico, and he collected many, many tropical specimens for which he was well known. He eventually ended up in California, and he continued his contact with his friend John K. Small. Small continued botanizing, taught at college levels, and then I'll tell you the rest of Small in a minute. I forgot about this. I have to tell you about the Yadkin River. So back in 1891, after they finished botanizing in Blowing Rock, they hiked down to the Yadkin River in Stanley County. Now, there's a section there known as the Narrows, and you can see the distance they came down the river. But there they found a goldenrod like nothing they'd ever seen before. And so the first sighting was in August of 1891. Small made notes of the goldenrod, and he graduated from Franklin and Marshall. They published the results in the Tory Bulletin, and then Small went to study at Columbia for his master's degree. And he made another visit to the Yadkin Valley in 1894, and he saw the goldenrod again. And by then he was absolutely convinced that there was no other goldenrod like this one. He wrote, "In the latter part of August 1894, I was surprised to find handsome specimens growing in crevices of the rocks at the bottom of the canyon at the falls of the Yadkin River, and at the Narrows, some miles above the falls in middle North Carolina. There is an abundant growth during the last part of August and the first weeks in September, but at other seasons, hardly a vestige of the species can be found." So he named it Solidago plumosa. Fast forward 100 years, and Alan Weekly, who is our botanical rock star of North Carolina, was hiking along the Yadkin River, and he happened to remember that journal entry from John Small, because he's got this encyclopedic mind of all the Latin names of every plant. And he started thinking, maybe that goldenrod, it's August, maybe that goldenrod is down there. And he had At this time, this was before GPS, before Google, he only had aerial maps taken by planes, but he could see that there were rocks along the river as Small had described them. And so after he finished his day work as the guy in charge of heritage plants in North Carolina, he decided to walk down to the rocks. This is the Narrows Dam. Now, Alcoa built an aluminum plant, and so a lot of people had assumed that all the plants in the area had been trashed by this hydroelectric generator and aluminum plant. So Weekly walked down to the water's edge, and he said, and there it was, the goldenrod. He said, I know my goldenrods. He said that day was one of the top 10 in all of his investigations to find. And he realized it was 100 years, almost to the day, from when John Small had written his journal entry about finding the goldenrod and naming it Solidaga plumosa. That was pretty interesting to me. This is a woman, Crystal Cockman of the Three Rivers Land Trust, and she paddled and found the goldenrod again a few years later and wrote a story about it. So John Conkle Small earned his PhD at Columbia. He worked there for several years, and then he was invited to help start the New York Botanical Garden. And he took his plant samples in 1898 and became the first curator of museums at the New York Botanical Garden. Now, Small had a passion for Florida. In the long run, he came back to the South almost every summer, bringing his family, because Florida was such a biodiverse state, and it was getting gobbled up by developers and as the 20th century went on. But he would go look for plants, and he brought his family. So that's his wife and his 2 sons and 2 daughters, and notice one son has a machete and the other has a shotgun. So he had a sense of humor about, the safety involved in going through the Florida Everglades. Here he is with what he called his weed wagon. He's in the suit. He's still collecting plants in a suit, which is kind of crazy. But he was really sad to see the Florida hammock begin to disappear. And he had a profound sense of loss because the wild South was quickly not becoming so wild anymore. There he is again, always in these dense forests. The state of Florida has more endangered plants than any other in the South, and it's second only behind Hawaii and California for the number of plants endangered because of the development. And of course, the people were endangered. The indigenous people of Florida were endangered, and they were people who helped John Small find species throughout. And his sons had to help with the plant hunting whether they wanted to or not. So John Small ended up publishing about 450 articles and studies, but much of his writing went unpublished because he had to pay for it himself. He helped Thomas Edison try to turn goldenrod into the equivalent of a rubber plant. Didn't quite work out. He also single-handedly saved the Louisiana Iris and discovered some 90 species of that iris. He died in 1938 in New York City, where he had lived his whole life and played in the Philharmonic. And I said, Donna, let's go to the New York Botanical Garden because I've never really been in an herbarium. I don't even know what it is. So we went to the New York Botanical Garden. And I called and asked them if we could see some of John Small's samples, and they said, sure. You want to give a talk while you're here? I'm like, no, I'm not an expert yet. So we got there, and it turned out that the Solidago plumosa samples were in Canada on tour. But we met this young fellow in the lobby, and we asked him if maybe we could see Heller's blazing star. So we thought, that'll do. He said, well, let's go look. So we went into the herbarium. These are giant metal cabinets that are full of shelves stacked with paper with the plant samples mounted on them, fluorescent lit, and Matt had to find the right cabinet to find this, blazing star. Well, he got in there and He said the Works Progress Administration paid people to mount most of these in the 30s, and they're now still behind accessioning plants that come in. Of course, they have cryopreservation of DNA of plants and many other methods, but they're still mounting those samples on paper. If I hadn't sort of been to these places and gotten lost in the woods myself writing this book, I never would have appreciated what it takes to really make this happen. So I was pretty excited, and Matthew comes and he opens the book, and there is John Small's sample, not of the Heller's blazing star, but of Liatris graminifolia, which they did get that day when they fell on the rocks in Blowing Rock. And as we looked closer, this is the graminifolia called grassleaf blazing star. It's a close specimen to the Heller's blazing star, but a little bit different. But it was still, there's Heller's. It was pretty exciting to see this pressed plant. And right at the bottom on the far right, it said S&H 1891, Small and Heller. The date the date is on there, and it's the date in the journal when he hurt his fingers. It was like, wow, that was really an exciting moment. So that was the first thing I did to start this book. It was really just a lucky way to begin, because I began to understand from right here in my own home territory what botanists do, how they do it. And I'm going to give you a little more from the book. The next chapter is about a tree that is the most endangered tree on the planet, and it's in Florida. It's a yew tree. It's a member of the yew family, but the Floridians have always called it gopher wood or stinking cedar. And remarkably, this tree became the basis for a theme park, of course, in Florida in the 1950s. There was this Baptist lay preacher and lawyer who was a failed candidate for governor in 1936. And he drew attention to the Florida torreya tree by claiming that Florida was actually the home of the Garden of Eden, not the Middle East, that at the confluence of the Chattahoochee, Flint, and Apalachicola rivers, that is where Adam and Eve began. And in fact, Noah's Ark was built from the Florida torreya tree, okay? So he opened his theme park, and he tacked signs on torreya trees all through this hilly territory, sandy hilly territory along the Apalachicola River, where the yew at that time was growing in abundance. He charged $1.10 admission, and you can see what nice people came to visit. Here is a tree that is holding the sign that says, "The leaves of gopher trees is a perfect design conveying a special divine message. No other tree in the world has such a message." Here is another tree that says, "Ladies, on this natural operating table, God took a rib from Adam's side and made Mother Eve." And then right here beside the parking lot is the birthplace of Adam. The bad news is that the Garden of Eden is in big trouble. Climate change has caused a fungus of some sort to develop in the tree. And even if you take it and plant it elsewhere, the fungus travels with it. It stunts its growth. And then the hurricanes have begun to hit that part of Florida. And in fact, Hurricane Michael went straight up the Apalachicola River and dropped larger trees on top of the torreya, even as conservation efforts were underway. So they've kind of been set back. The trees are not very tall, but what the folks at Atlanta Botanical Garden are afraid that this tree is going to go the way of the American chestnut. And so they are trying as hard as they can to plant some new seeds in the forest and try to keep the torreya trees alive and well so that until they figure out how to cure the fungus, basically. So we had a chance to join a couple of landowners who have given their property to allow Atlanta Botanical Garden folks to plant torreya seeds. And we went out into the woods and we found some seedlings that they had planted a few years before, and we also were witness to their planting new seeds. In fact, you can see Donna is picking up on the Michelangelo story of creation here. That is a torreya seed about to be planted on private land. Now, the Endangered Species Act protects endangered species on public land, but not on private land. But private landowners can have a big role in helping in conservation by allowing endangered species to be planted and protected on their lands. So there's a little seedling that in this massive forest, they found this little seedling with amazing tracking devices that Atlanta Botanical Garden has. It was really a thrill to see them coming up. They're monitoring them with all kinds of devices, checking the light in the tree canopy and the humidity and how often it rains. And actually one of the plants, the seedlings, had been almost hit by a tree during the hurricane. These are the two landowners we met who are allowing this project to take place on their land. And the dog's name is Irish, and he went with us on this big hike. It was a very enjoyable day to meet these animated and convicted, passionate people who are helping, just as regular citizens. Here's where a tree almost hit the torreyas that were coming up, the little seedlings in the cage. It was also really great to see all these women working in the field. There's an effort in botanical circles to involve people, engage people of color, women, others who are not necessarily have not historically been welcome in the environmental community. There's also a group at Duke working. This is the torreya tree that's in Duke Gardens, and Annabelle Renwick spent some time with me to explain their project. In another secret location, in Duke Forest, there is a grove of torreya trees that are being grown. They were set back when voles ate the seeds, but what they didn't do is destroy the DNA, so the seeds still produce seedlings, but they completely messed up their monitoring system of which plant was which seed and so forth. They get their seeds from the Atlanta Botanical Garden, and they have to haul water into Duke Forest to water and protect these plants, and they're working very hard to have them produce seed. It'll be 12 to 15 years and a major investment by Duke Gardens to be a part of this project. And there are other gardens around the South that are also helping to protect the torreya tree. We met a forest ranger in Florida who went to the Garden of Eden when she was a kid. She grew up in Florida. Her dad took her to see the Garden of Eden, and as an adult, she developed cancer, and her treatment came from the yew tree, not the torreya tree, but from a close cousin. And she felt like she'd really come full circle. She's now retired, and we stay in touch, and she's still trying to grow all kinds of stuff in her yard. She's had some health issues since recovering from cancer. But anyway, so it was those kinds of stories that we fell into through the course of discovering these plants and learning about them. Plant people are good people, and we really, really enjoyed the folks we met who were so dedicated and continuing, even in retirement, to do this work. There are the torreya trees that are still there in the old parking lot where Adam was born. And they look pretty sickly. They just can't get purchase and grow very well with this fungus. But there are people at the University of Florida who are trying to find a cure. So I just want to leave you with these ideas that private landowners can make a big difference in conservation, so there may be some way you can help a local botanical group to conserve species. Community identity can happen around a plant. There's a chapter in the book about a lily that blooms between Mother's Day and Father's Day on a river in Alabama, And that lily has transformed a small town, and they have a big lily celebration, and all these people come to the river, and they bring their lawn chairs, and they sit in the shallows, and they stare at the lilies that are only there for a month. And they have taken an old abandoned building in town and turned it into the Lily Center. And they have a flag that has the lily on their town flag. So that plant has become their community identity. It's not on the endangered species list. It was ready to be put on the list, and they declared a moratorium the year that it was to go on the list. So the town passed a law that nobody can poach, nobody can touch these bulbs that are caught in the rocks on these shale shallows and bloom once a year. So, and this particular plant also has bridged racial problems in Alabama. For folks who were raised in an era when black folks were hung from trees, nature was not a real friendly idea to some folks. And now the society that is protecting the lily is making sure that all the people in the people shed, as they call it, along the river understand what a treasure the river is. It's the only river in Alabama that does not have an impoundment, and that's why the lilies thrive there. It's not been dammed in any way. And so kids are getting out on the river, kids of all colors, kids who may have been afraid of water or afraid of the woods, and bridges are being built across differences in Alabama because of that one flower. And then finally, the southern landscape is who we are. We talk about the weather, we plant plants, we have gardens. It's who we are. And I hate to see it go away, because then we won't know who we are. So that's kind of the gist of the book. And it came out of the Month of Their Ripening, and I wouldn't take anything for the folks that we've met. Thank you all.